Good evening and welcome to LaRouche PAC's Saturday night class. I'm Susan Kokinda and I'm going to be presenting tonight a discussion on lessons in the art of war learned from both Lyndon LaRouche and Donald Trump. I'll be joined later by Tony Pappert, who will join us during the question and answer period. But the title of this discussion, Lessons in the Art of War, is obviously very appropriate to the moment that we're in, because we certainly are in warfare. We're in political warfare. That will escalate this week, probably, or this coming week, if indeed an indictment of Donald Trump comes down from the Manhattan grand jury. We are in an economic warfare. As our standard of living, our population, our manufacturing have been under attack for decades and now are under increasing attack as we see the meltdown of the globalist speculative financial system. But really, it is a spiritual warfare. And while everyone, I'm sure, on this call and watching subsequently has been engaged in some form of political warfare for some part, at least, of the last 7 years since Donald Trump announced for president in 2016. And while tonight's discussion is going to center around particular economic conceptions put forward both by Donald Trump and by Lyndon LaRouche, at the core of this discussion really is the spiritual fight, because we are certainly fighting against principalities and powers and evil in high places. But I would say that it's recognizing that it is a spiritual fight that gives us access to what could be considered the ultimate flank against the enemy. What is the enemy's weakest flank? At a meeting we conducted here in Michigan last week, I asked people in the audience, what did they think was the enemy's weakest flank? And several people said the economy, which is certainly a legitimate answer. One person said, well, it's the fact that they push evil things, satanic things, like drug trafficking and human trafficking. And that's certainly an understandable answer. But I think that their weak flank really is defined from this spiritual standpoint. That is, their weak flank is that their very view of how the universe works and the image of man and the role of man in that universe is wrong and it's evil. They believe that the universe is entropic, that it's winding down. You know, either God is dead or he wound up the universe and then he retired or something like that. Because of that, we're using up our resources, we're using up the planet. And that fundamentally we're no better than beasts. And we're largely defined by our sensual desires and our sexual preferences. Actually, given the worldview of these people, we're lower than the beasts, because I don't think a male dog is going to go out there and try and change its sex to be a female dog, as these guys advocate. On the other hand, Lyndon LaRouche passionately believed and understood that the universe is creative. It's not entropic, but rather it continues to develop, and that mankind is a microcosm of that macrocosm. Or to put it another way, there is a creator. And we are made in the image of that creator. And we find through our reason and our creativity the joy of exerting greater dominion over nature and in advancing God's creation. And through that knowledge, we can discover universal principles. We can act to make our nations and indeed our planet better. This is a powerful idea. It's optimistic. And it's what moves people to take bold and courageous actions, often surprising actions, which are precisely the kinds of actions that can defeat a seemingly very powerful evil, that evil in high places. Now, I think Donald Trump understands this. And I think from a negative standpoint, so does our enemy, because they constantly want you reacting. They want you charging against the evil. One of the ways that we've recently seen this is especially in states like Michigan and Minnesota, where we just lost the Republican majority in our state legislatures. And now we have Democratic legislatures, executive branches, and so on. We are being flooded by criminal, psychotic, satanic legislation, whether it's taking our guns away or assaulting our children or eating away at our basic constitutional rights. It's just a constant flood of legislation. And I know that here in Michigan and other states like Minnesota, many of the grassroots activists, as one described it, have been beating a path to the state legislature every week to testify against this psychotic legislation. But that poses, I think, a problem in thinking. That is, people are thinking tactically at best. Some are simply reacting, where people actually have to think strategically. I mean, if you look at the current situation, I certainly know it in Michigan, we simply don't have the votes to stop this stuff until 2025, assuming we get a new legislature. So don't use up all your ammunition fighting battles today that you can't win. It doesn't mean you don't fight, but it cannot be the focus of where you put your efforts if you actually want to win the war. And they want you to do this. They want you to constantly be reacting. They want you to fight on their territory. Now, I want to give you an example of the fact that the enemy, the globalists with their democratic foot soldiers, do have a very clear conception of this. And I will say, unfortunately, the globalists deploy their Democratic Party in a much more strategic top-down manner than many of the grassroots and the MAGA movement do. Now, I think one of the great benefits of now being in a presidential campaign, with Donald Trump having announced his campaign for the presidency, which is clearly going to define our activities through November of 2024, the potential for us operating from a top-down strategic perspective is before us. I think much more clearly than what we did in the midterms, where too much of the territory, again, was defined by the enemy. And we saw what the outcome was of that in many of the frontline industrial states like Michigan and Pennsylvania. But as I say, the enemy, unfortunately, has a better, I think, strategic view of this. And I want to share with you a report from a particular Democratic think tank. It's more than a think tank. They run dirty tricks for the Democratic Party. So it's probably a fairly highly deployed operation. It has the rather odd name for them of American Family Values. But I'm going to share my screen and show you a report that they released less than a month ago. It's entitled, as you see there, A Strategy for Factory Towns. And they do recognize that they have a problem in these areas. They certainly had it in 2016, because this is how Trump won in 2016, by winning over the blue-collar voters in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, and other states like that. So they went into these factory towns in the industrial Midwest to find out what makes them tick and what they're thinking. And they apparently did they contracted somebody to do a poll in terms of what affects the voters the most in terms of especially in these blue collar areas, what it is they are concerned about. And as you can see there, 37% consider the rising cost of living as the most fundamental issue, jobs in the economy second, and then you get into the issues that the mainstream media, whether it's right or left, so dearly likes to talk about, which is protecting democracy, moral values, and other kinds of questions. Not that they're not important, although we know protecting democracy is just the code word for trying to wipe out the MAGA movement. But the fundamental point is that the singular issue on the minds of people in these blue collar factory areas is the economy and the cost of living. And they then did an analysis of this. And what they discovered, here you can see over on the left, is if the Republicans organize purely around the culture war message, they're going to lose. It'll be 50-41. And this large light blue chunk here, these are probably your swing blue collar voters. They are not moved on these culture issues, or they don't even agree on these culture issues as they may be defined. But this think tank concludes, if the Republicans go with an economic message over here, they win with 46-43, and you can see they've pulled over a lot of these soft, I guess you'd call them soft Democrats, which is what gives them their margin of victory. Now, in other words, they get it. They understand that the question of the economy is the issue that they will lose on, and it's the issue that Republicans will win on. Now, what I want to do tonight is develop the nature of that economic agenda in light of what I said earlier, that this actually is a spiritual question, which in actuality encompasses the cultural questions, but encompasses the cultural questions from this larger standpoint. And I want to show initially how Donald Trump's recent initiatives, which he's been putting forward on Truth Social and then on Rumble under his Agenda 47 series of policy proposals, how these demonstrate, to my thinking, that Trump has a grasp of how to deploy this flank strategically to defeat what seems to be a superior force when you look at the globalist control over the financial system and the mainstream media and the intelligence community and on and on and on. But they are defeatable. And I think it's only when thinking from the standpoint that Trump certainly grasps, and which I think Lyndon LaRouche and our movement puts in a more rigorous or scientific way of thinking about it, that is how we can outflank this seemingly superior enemy. Now, so I'm going to go through some recent and not so recent statements from Donald Trump, because again, clearly to my thinking, he gets it in terms of how this fight has to be fought. And I think it's the case that too much of his grassroots support movement and people in the Republican Party, too few of them actually understand it, at least at the level that Donald Trump does. So my intention in the first part of this discussion is to present to you, again, from the standpoint of Trump's a number of his recent initiatives, and again, a not so recent initiative, how we need to be thinking about this. So first of all, Trump, I think, very clearly understands the nature of the enemy. And I'm going to share the screen again. And this is a statement that Trump made just yesterday. This is a larger statement. Again, it's on Rumble. People should be subscribing to this and keeping up with it. Very strong statement talking about the need to prevent World War III. But what I found singularly striking about this is, again, his conception of who the enemy is. He's not looking at this at eye level. He says, but the greatest threat to Western civilization today is not Russia. It's probably more than anything else, ourselves, and some of the horrible USA hating people that represent us. It's the collapse of the nuclear family and fertility rates like nobody can believe is happening. These globalists want to squander all of America's strength, blood, and treasure, chasing monsters and phantoms overseas, while keeping us distracted from the havoc they're creating right here at home. These forces are doing more damage to America than Russia and China could ever have dreamed. And I think that's extremely important, because you cannot have a strategy if you don't have a clear conception of who your enemy is. And while it's the case, I did see a recent poll that most Republicans no longer think Russia is the enemy. I think it's like only 12%, even though the poor brainwashed Democrats still do. A large portion of Republicans believe that China is the, quote, enemy. And Trump is clear, they're not the enemy. We may have conflicts. We obviously have differences in systems, in economic policies, and so on. But the question of who the enemy is, a global elite who earlier in that statement he identifies as the crazy neocons who have gotten us into war after war, and who indeed are pushing us closer to World War III. So that's number one. He clearly has a superior conception of who the enemy is than many of the talking heads, including so-called conservative talking heads that people listen to all the time. Secondly, he is beginning to present an articulated American economic policy. And I'm going to share with you a short video excerpt from one of his Agenda 47 discussions on our manufacturing and our trade policy. And as you listen to this, I want you to reflect on the fact that not only is it not a free trade policy, which Trump is very clear on, and I think many MAGA people are very clear on, it's also not a free market policy, because free trade and free market are essentially the same thing. So let me go to that. This is entitled, oh, it's the wrong one. There we go. This is entitled, President Trump announces America First trade platform that takes sledgehammer to globalization. So again, he's leaving nothing to the imagination.
Domestic producers and rewards outsourcers to a system that rewards domestic production and taxes foreign companies and those who export American jobs. They will be rewarded, and rewarded greatly, and our country will benefit. To achieve this goal, we will phase in a system of universal baseline tariffs on most foreign products. On top of this, higher tariffs will increase incrementally depending on how much individual foreign countries devalue their currency. They devalue their currency to take advantage of the United States, and they subsidize their industries or otherwise engage in trade cheating and abuse. And they do it now like never before, and we had it largely stopped, and it was going to be stopped completely within less than a year. As tariffs on foreign producers go up, taxes on American producers will go down, and go down very substantially, and that means a lot of jobs coming in. Not only will this system end our gaping trade deficits, and they are massive right now, and bring back millions of American jobs, It will also bring trillions and trillions of dollars pouring into the United States Treasury from foreign countries and allow us to invest that money in American workers, American families, and American communities. This plan will be the linchpin of a new strategic national manufacturing initiative that builds on my historic success in ending NAFTA, which was a tremendous thing, a tremendous achievement. Nobody thought it could be done. And we did USMCA, US, Mexico, Canada. And it was an incredible thing.
All right. All right. So in a sense, that's a bit of familiar territory. I mean, this is what Trump ran on in 2016. This is what won him over the large chunks of blue collar and independent voters in the industrial Midwest. But he's reiterating it again, I think, with a force and a passion, which is absolutely appropriate to the intensity of the fight that we're engaged in right now. But he was recently put forward a bold new initiative. But before I turn to that, I want to, in a sense, set the table and give a sense that while it's a bold new initiative on Trump's part in one respect, it's very much in keeping with his optimistic view of civilization and mankind, and a view that he put forward in a very unusual setting. Back in January of 2020, right before the pandemic took over the world, Trump did something very Trumpian. He traveled to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. He marched right into the belly of the beast, and he confronted this globalist elite with their philosophical pessimism and evil, and counterposed to it his policies for the United States, and indeed policies as a model for the world. I'm going to share the screen again and read one section from that speech, because it articulates again what differentiates Donald Trump from certainly every other presidential or potential Republican presidential candidate running for office, and just makes very clear that his outlook is, in a certain sense, revolutionary. So this is from a part of his speech. He says, America achieved this stunning turnaround not by making minor changes to a handful of policies, but by adopting a whole new approach centered entirely on the well-being of the American worker. Every decision we make on taxes, trade, energy, immigration, education, and more is focused on improving the lives of everyday Americans. And we're determined to ensure that the working and middle class reap the greatest gains. Today, I hold up the American model as an example to the world of a working system of free enterprise that will produce the most benefits for the most people in the 21st century and beyond. A pro-worker, pro-citizen, pro-family agenda that demonstrates how a nation can thrive when its communities, its companies, its government, and its people work together for the good of the whole nation. Now, let me just set one setting here. All right. So, I mean, that is a critically important theme, which a few Republicans like Josh Hawley, Senator Josh Hawley, and others have picked up on. But again, what Trump is doing, again, from a politically strategic standpoint in this instance, is he's literally creating a new Republican Party based on the policies, the principles that he identified at Davos, and really challenged the World Economic Forum elite, who obviously have a very different conception. Their world is one in which a handful of billionaires rule over the rest of us as a bunch of serfs and slaves, all the while probably calling the herd. So that was one aspect of his speech, and he elaborated it further. But then he did something which was really quite stunning. And I'm going to once again share the video and hope this works a little better than the last one.
Any challenge by far. The great scientific breakthroughs of the 20th century, from penicillin to high-yield wheat to modern transportation and breakthrough vaccines, have lifted living standards and saved billions of lives around the world, and we're continuing to work on things that you'll be hearing about in the near future, that even today, sitting here right now, you wouldn't believe it's possible, that we have found the answers. You'll be hearing about it, but we have found answers to things that people said would not be possible, certainly not in a very short period of time. But the wonders of the last century will pale in comparison to what today's young innovators will achieve, because they are doing things that nobody thought even feasible to begin. We continue to embrace technology, not to shun it. When people are free to innovate, millions will live longer, happier, healthier lives. For 3 years now, America has shown the world that the path to a prosperous future begins with putting workers first, choosing growth, and freeing entrepreneurs to bring their dreams to life. For anyone who doubts what is possible in the future, we need only look at the towering achievements of the past. Only a few hundred miles from here are some of the great cities of Europe, teeming centers of commerce and culture. Each of them is full of reminders of what human drive and imagination can achieve. Centuries ago, at the time of the Renaissance, skilled craftsmen and laborers looked upwards and built the structures that still touch the human heart. To this day, some of the greatest structures in the world have been built hundreds of years ago. In Italy, the citizens once started construction on what would be a 140-year project, the Duomo of Florence. Incredible, incredible place. While the technology did not yet exist to complete their design, city fathers forged ahead anyway, certain that they would figure it out someday. These citizens of Florence did not accept limits to their high aspirations. And so the Great Dome was finally built. In France, another century.
All right. For those of you who perhaps have followed or been part of the LaRouche movement for many, many years, Trump's reference to the cathedral in Florence, the Duomo, the Great Dome of Florence, is something that Lyndon LaRouche devoted a great deal of attention to in terms of what it represented. For LaRouche, it was a towering example of the essence of actual human economics. And when LaRouche was jailed in 1989 by what we today call the deep state, but is largely the Bush-run intelligence apparatus, and LaRouche's jailing, the process which led to LaRouche's jailing was precipitated by the now infamous Robert Mueller. So there is certainly a coherence between a commonality between our enemies and Donald Trump's enemies, for good reason, because we fight for the same principles. But when LaRouche was jailed in 1989 and served 5 years in jail, he continued to write. And one of the perhaps the most important thing that he wrote while he was incarcerated was this book entitled The Science of Christian Economy. And the cover of that book is precisely the dome, which Donald Trump referenced in his diplomatic, perhaps, but nonetheless confrontation with the Davos elite in 2020. Now, I often comment to people that the title of this is paradoxical in and of itself. I mean, stop and think. How often do you see the words science, Christian, and economy linked together in this way? But the question of Brunelleschi, the question of the construction of this dome in Florence by a great architect and great thinker named Brunelleschi really does exemplify why this conception of the science of Christian economy and why LaRouche put so much attention to this question. Because as Trump referenced in his speech, this took 140 years to build. Now, the reason was its initial construction was halted by the onset of the Black Death and the Dark Age in Europe at the end of the 1300s. But as Trump also pointed out, when the people of Florence decided to build the dome, they had started it and they had created this, the underlying structure, and they wanted to build a dome which was bigger than anything that had ever been built before. So they started to build the base of it, but they actually did not have the technology to complete it. And it wasn't until after the Dark Age passed and the Renaissance began that a great thinker and a great architect, a great scientist named Brunelleschi came up with the solution, the technological innovation to build this dome. Now, what he discovered, the principle that he discovered, which allowed him to build this is a freestanding dome. And when it was built without internal scaffolding. In other words, you didn't build some kind of scaffolding and the workers went up there, stood on the scaffolding, and then constructed the dome. This was constructed where it was self-sustaining as they built it. And it necessitated the discovery of a new principle in order to figure out how to construct, what is the shape of this dome. Now, that principle is also something near and dear to Lyndon LaRouche in terms of his discussions of economics and universal principles. And that is the principle of the catenary. The catenary is a curve which is created, it's the curve which a hanging chain, and I'm holding one right here, not my necklace because it's got a pendant on it, but here's a hanging chain which creates a certain kind of shape. Now, the importance of the catenary and the importance of this shape, this is not some kind of mathematical figure, you know, like a parabola or a hyperbola. This is the actual shape of this curve is something which is created by gravity. It's created by a physical process in the physical space-time of the universe. Now, think about it. If you're trying to create a freestanding structure, without internal scaffolding, using a shape which is generated by gravity, i.e. the catenary, and not some kind of mathematical formula, which might be an elegant mathematical formula, but may not reflect the actual physical process of the universe. Well, it might be a good idea to use the shape which is generated by a physical process, namely gravity. And that's what Brunelleschi did in discovering how to lay the bricks, what kind of configuration he needed to lay the bricks to build this extraordinarily large and beautiful dome. So that was one aspect of it, that he had to discover a principle in the universe, or rather discover how to use that principle, that physical principle in the universe, to build the dome. The other aspect of what he did is he had to educate the workforce in precisely how these principles worked in order to get them to go up hundreds and hundreds of feet and build this. If they thought he was a crackpot or they didn't understand this, remember, this had never been done before. This was a new technology. So he had to actually educate the workforce to understand what they were doing, to have the confidence to go up and build this dome. And it took 20 years, which is actually, I mean, given what we see today in terms of regulations and idiocy, I mean, sometimes it takes 20 years to build, 10 miles of road, given the insanity of our current culture and regulatory system. In that 20 years, nobody died. Not a single worker died. And I was thinking, as I was revisiting this, I was thinking about this. When we built the Mackinac Bridge here in Michigan back in the mid-1950s, this is 500 years later after the dome, because the dome was completed in the 1400s during the Renaissance in Florence. 500 years later, when we built the Mackinac Bridge, I think it was about a dozen people died in the course of building the bridge. There's a monument, there's a statue overlooking the Straits of Mackinac, which lists the names of the workers who died building the bridge. And yet 500 years ago, this incredible structure was built without anybody losing their life. Now, when I had a discussion of this last week at the meeting we had, we sort of developed the idea of Brunelleschi economics. That is what the dome represents, what Brunelleschi did, and what LaRouche further developed is this process of man's mind developing a new principle, translating it into a technological breakthrough, and educating the population to understand it and to implement it. That's Brunelleschi economics. That's Lyndon LaRouche's economics. I wanted to develop that conception before I show you the last video clip from Donald Trump. This is a proposal that he advanced about 2 weeks ago, again, as part of his Agenda 47 series of policy proposals. And this one is entitled, "A New Quantum Leap to Revolutionize the American Standard of Living." And let me get to the...
In the American state, how good it was, how great it was for our country. Our objective will be a quantum leap in the American standard of living. That's what will happen. Here are just a few of the ways we can do it. Almost 1/3 of the land mass of the United States is owned by the federal government, with just a very, very small portion of that land, just a fraction, 1/2 of 1%. Would you believe that? We should hold a contest to charter up to 10 new cities and award them to the best proposals for development. In other words, we'll actually build new cities in our country again. These freedom cities will reopen the frontier, reignite American imagination, and give hundreds of thousands of young people and other people, all hardworking families, a new shot at home ownership and, in fact, the American dream. Another big opportunity.
All right. I mean, look, you cannot look at that, and he says more than just that, but you cannot look at that um, in the light of what he said at Davos and the significance of the Great Dome in Florence, and not recognize that what he's really talking about is Renaissance cities. He is talking about a revolution in the American standard of living created by increasing the productivity of the population through technological breakthroughs. At a later point in this, he also talks about the need to grow the population and create a baby boom with baby bonuses. Now, if anybody watching this live or subsequently has fallen for the idiotic line that Trump's proposal is the same thing as the World Economic Forum's 15-minute cities, by which they mean, you know, everybody is going to live in a city and everything will be within 15 minutes of you, because basically you're going to end up being a serf on a, you know, feudal plantation, only with, you know, access to the cyber world. And that line is out there. We've had it fed back to us. Oh, Trump is pushing 15-minute cities. This is the most idiotic thing I've ever heard. The World Economic Forum, the Davos crowd, they hate human beings, they hate technology, and they want to kill people. They want to reduce the world's population. Donald Trump is talking about beautiful Renaissance development. He's talking about technological progress, and he wants more people. So again, anybody who's fallen for this ought to just take a deep breath and think about what caused them to, you know, make such a silly conclusion that because Trump is talking about cities and the World Economic Forum is talking about cities, they're the same thing. But again, this is Brunelleschi economics. This is LaRouche's economics. The question of developing your workforce, developing your population by building bold new things, by being optimistic, by conquering the frontiers. And obviously, this is only part of a necessary policy. When Trump was in the White House, he revived our space program with the Artemis project. Much of what he did was not really recognized, but he laid the basis in terms of the advances that are currently being made in terms of reviving our nuclear industry and the breakthroughs that are taking place around the promise of thermonuclear fusion. This is modern day Brunelleschi economics or LaRouche economics. So why don't most people think this way? I mean, Trump does think this way. Well, obviously, one side of it is that the enemy has suppressed the knowledge of our real economic history. Those great Americans who have this conception, again, of what I'm calling for purposes of this discussion, Brunelleschi economics, that is economics based on the constant advancing of our mastery over nature, the constant advancing of our ability to exert dominion over nature through our unique, as a species, creative capabilities. Anybody who developed those ideas or propagated those ideas has been suppressed, and in some cases rather brutally. People like Alexander Hamilton, who was assassinated by a British agent, an actual British agent, even though he was nominally an American, Aaron Burr. Lincoln was assassinated. He revived this quality of economics. Very, as my colleague Bob Ingram has developed extensively in classes and in books. Lincoln had a passionate understanding and appreciation for the power of the human mind. William McKinley, the last American system president that we had, assassinated in 1901. Lyndon LaRouche, incarcerated by the Bush apparatus on orders from the same British imperial system that we've been at war with for over 200 years. And of course, now the attacks, the persecution, everything that's been thrown against President Trump. But the enemy didn't just suppress this. They substituted their own perverted way of thinking about economics. And in the final part of my discussion, I want to introduce to some of you, or reintroduce to others who may be familiar with this, a pedagogical example that, or device that Lyndon LaRouche developed way back in the 1990s, which I think will hopefully help people begin to sort out in their minds the difference between the perverted form of economics that dominates our discussion today and what, again, for the purposes of this discussion, we're calling Brunelleschi economics. And this is Lyndon LaRouche's famous triple curve. So let me share the screen one more time. And we will go to his triple curve. This is, again, a pedagogical device he developed, which I really think will help people thread their way through the insanity of what normally passes for economic discussion, certainly among the talking heads. The first thing I want to just make clear, these curves don't represent aggregate values. They represent changes in the rate. So the bottom curve, which we see collapsing, and it has been doing that for many, many decades. The bottom curve is the rate of change of the collapse of the physical economy. In other words, if we were to pretend that GNP actually represented physical economy, which it doesn't, but pretend for a moment that it does, we're not saying that at this point in the curve, the GNP was 1, and at this point in the curve, the GNP was 1/2. This is a more dynamic conception. It's the rate of change of the collapse, which frankly is more dramatic. This curve reflects what has happened to our living standards, to our manufacturing, to our infrastructure, everything which is encompassed in the physical processes that are necessary to support a society and ideally to ensure that a society actually grows. We've been doing the opposite for many, many decades. I'm not going to get into the details and in terms of when we began to ratchet down, but certainly 1971 was one beginning nodal point in terms of the ratchet downward. The middle curve that you see here, the lighter gray one, this is monetary aggregates. So again, this is the rate of change. So the rate of change of the issuance of monetary aggregates has been increasing. And then this top curve, and these are, especially when you get to some of these curves, you're looking at an exponential curve here. This is financial aggregates. This is all the speculative crap, derivatives, in all of its different manifestations, mortgage-backed securities, collateralized loan obligations, everything the hedge funds play with, currencies, derivatives on currency swaps. This is just pure speculative gambling. And again, the rate of increase has been hyperbolic. Now, unfortunately, as we'll see in a minute, this process has metastasized and is worse than what you're seeing right now. But before we go to that, I want to show you what a healthy economy would look like. A healthy economy would be one in which you're constantly increasing the rate of change of your ability to produce, with this curve going up. And that would be supported by the issuance of money and the issuance of, financial instruments appropriate to it, like, old-fashioned stocks where you hold a stock in an actual company. Those would be financial aggregates and, other kinds of things such as that. But the rate of growth is less than the rate of growth of the increase of your productive capacity. That's a healthy economy. That is, by constantly increasing the productive power of your workforce through scientific and technological innovations, you're fostering this process of an acceleration of your productive ability. That's a healthy economy. We have not had one of those probably since the 1960s, under the influence of the Apollo project and the great technological breakthroughs and spin-offs into our domestic economy, that was launched by Kennedy. So that, again, that's a healthy economy. Outside of us, baby boomers and older, probably most people participating in this call have never lived in such an economy. But now it's even worse. And this is what we've been experiencing pretty much since the 2008 blowout, when they started running the printing presses at 0% interest rates for the last 15 years or so, which has probably never been done before in history, where the rate of increase of the amount of money you're pumping out becomes faster than even the rate of increase of your crazy financial derivatives. And that's when you get inflation, hyperinflation, and so on. We're now at a fourth stage, another stage in this process. I actually didn't have a chance to find the triple curve example of that. But because the Federal Reserve has decided to slow down the rate of increase of monetary emissions because of the inflationary problems, we're at a point right now where both of these curves are on the verge of collapsing, along with the impact on the physical economic economy. But it is these two curves, the financial and the monetary, this is what dominates economic discussion. The reason people don't talk like Donald Trump did in Davos, or in the speech about building new cities, or on a manufacturing policy, is because people tend to not think in the terms of the physical economy. They're living in the world dominated by financial and monetary aggregates. And what I think is important, what is critical at this point in the fight for our nation's future and survival, is that more people think at least like Donald Trump, and more people start to think like Lyndon LaRouche. That is, address the optimism that comes with actually building things, with unleashing the productive power of the human mind to, again, exert greater dominion over nature. That is what's embedded in Trump's Freedom Cities proposal. He's thrown out the challenge. He wants 10 of them, and he wants people to begin to put forward designs for these freedom cities. When we discussed this at the meeting we had here in Michigan last week, and we threw out the idea to people, well, how are we going to get people to even know that Trump is talking about these kinds of things? How are we going to get people optimistic again? One person said, well, why don't we make coloring books for children in terms of, building these freedom cities? And, given the way AI works these days, you could probably just, have one of this would be a good use for AI, just give them the assignment of, the kinds of pictures you would want to have in a coloring book and give them to children. But imagine, going to community colleges with the challenge, or big colleges, but I tend to think the people at community colleges are a little more grounded in reality these days, with the challenge, all sorts of challenges. Where would you put these cities? How would you deal with the resource questions of not having enough water in the West, which is where most of the federal land is? What should be the economic focus of some of these cities? There are federal lands here in Michigan, and there have been proposals for building space launch facilities on the shore of Lake Huron and on the shore of Lake Superior. I bet there's some federal land around those areas. What about building a Freedom City here with the focus of becoming a space launch port? And giving people, as Trump said, bold new visions, the chance to build a new city, to have a standard of living where one income can actually support a family. And when he talks about a revolution in living standards, that's where it has to go. At the same time, we have our own project Prometheus, which is to unleash critical areas of technological and scientific advance, especially nuclear power. And frankly, if you're going to have freedom cities, you're going to need a lot of power. If we're going to figure out how to deal with the water problem you need, especially in the West for new cities, you're going to need a lot of power. That means nuclear. And we've proposed 1,000 nuclear plants to be built over the coming decades. But we need the new technologies as well, like thermonuclear fusion, which recently had a breakthrough, a critical proof of principle breakthrough at Lawrence Livermore last December. This is how you run a flank. Drawing people into the optimism and the excitement of what it is to be human is the way that you defeat the evil and the pessimism and the bestiality of the enemy. And I want to conclude by asking those who are on this call tonight and who may be watching it subsequently on YouTube, use this presentation to get the discussion started. This is what we need to be discussing in our local MAGA meetings, in our Republican Party district meetings, in our trade union meetings, especially here in the Midwest. People putting their minds into this kind of exciting future and fueling our fight for 2024, not with a kind of grim, dogged determination. We must be determined. There's no doubt about that. But instead, fueling our fight going into 2024 with the incredible optimism which Trump channels at almost every opportunity, and what really is the essence of what the American Republic is all about. So I'll conclude my remarks with that and turn it over to Tony to open it up for discussion.